Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the lodger was veiled, the face was yellow, and the valley was fearsome, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder what kind of medical practice Dr. Watson actually ran? Or about the number of Holmes's monographs? Or how much the rent was at 221B Baker Street?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 293, Carina. Hello there, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you ready to sing for your supper here?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes. Can I have an A, please, on the keyboard?
There you go.
Oh, thanks very much. Good.
All right. Well, I haven't eaten yet, so this should be interesting. This is going to be an interesting episode because we have talked previously about musicians in the canon. I think it was back, episodes maybe 139, 140. We did a two-parter on composers and their works in episode 139, and then musicians and instruments and venues in part 2. And I think going way back, episode 40 or so, we talked about Sarasate. So we're going to go in a little different direction this time around. Just as a reminder, show notes are available at ihose.co/trifles293, all lowercase. That'll take you directly to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website, where we will have links to these previous episodes and other things, including the ability to support us on Patreon. That's right. When you support us on Patreon, every month you are automatically entered into a drawing where you could be randomly chosen to receive back issues of the Baker Street Journal, our sponsor. And every quarter, we give away one free subscription to the Baker Street Journal currently. So, again, all you have to do is support us on Patreon at any level. So check all those levels of support out and do what works for you. Well, we are going to talk about Carina in this episode, and I suppose the first thing for us to do, Bert, is to identify exactly where we find Carina in the canon.
That seems to me to be very reasonable. It is in The Retired Colorman, which our listeners will find in their copy, regardless of how it's organized or published, of the casebook of Sherlock Holmes, and it's a reference in The Retired Colorman.
Excellent. Well, and in that story, Holmes and Watson are heading off to a concert, and we've had other instances of the two of them enjoying concerts. There was, of course, Holmes going to listen to Sarasate. I think that was in the Red-Headed League as he was in the stalls at St. James. And he talked about going to see Les Huguenots and Wagner at Covent Garden. I think that was in The Hound of the Baskervilles. So it's interesting that we, at least in my recollection, we never covered this particular visit to the concert hall and this particular singer. So
No, we've not, and it's high time we did. I would just like to point out that a little bit more, though, about the reference where it pops up. And the retired colorman Watson has gone to do some investigating on his own, and he hasn't done well. And Holmes is giving him a long list of questions he hasn't asked, places he didn't go, people he didn't speak to. And it turns out that Holmes has acquired a lot of this information. And Watson is surprised. He says, well, he would normally have said, how did that happen? And Holmes says, thanks to the telephone.
Huh.
And the help of the yard. I can usually get my essentials without leaving this room. And, he goes on and he says, my information confirms the man's story, and then et cetera, et cetera. And then Holmes says, well, let us escape from this weary workaday world by the side door of music. Carina sings tonight at the Albert Hall, and we still have time to dress, dine, and enjoy.
That sounds like a lovely evening out, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, why don't we start with the location, where they're heading? You say Royal Albert Hall. They're heading to the Albert Hall. Now, Albert Hall, he's an actor who appeared in Apocalypse Now, if I recall. What was Albert Hall?
Yeah, what was Albert Hall? Well, Albert Hall is a major venue in London, created in honor of the departed, was he Prince Regent? Anyway, it's Victoria's husband, Albert, and it's named after him. And the Albert Hall is a wonderful, acoustically interesting, huge, highly valued concert hall in London, where it's wonderful. I've been to the Albert Hall and heard concerts there, and it's round. One of the lovely things about it is that it is, like many structures in England and in Oxford and elsewhere, round and acoustically vibrant.
Indeed. And according to the footnote in the Sherlock Holmes Reference Library, which was edited and annotated by Les Klinger, it was built in the Italian Renaissance style, destined for concerts, scientific and art assemblies, and other similar uses. The building, which was constructed from 1867 to 1871 from designs by Fouke and Scott, is actually oval in form, measuring 270 feet by 240 feet and 810 feet in circumference. It can accommodate 8,000 people comfortably. No mention how many people it can accommodate uncomfortably. But
yeah, well, I imagine they'd be sitting on each other's laps.
They might. And of course, if any of you have seen Hitchcock's famous film, The Man Who Knew Too Much, the penultimate scene there, where suspense was building, and I think there was a royal figure that was destined to be assassinated by gunshot at a specific time during the concert. It took place at Royal Albert Hall, so very familiar scenes there to many people in the entertainment world.
Well, and there are many Sherlockian connections, about the Albert Hall. For example, I'm sure you know this. In England, in London's parks for a very long time, for over a century, they had been holding promenade concerts. Those are concerts that allow the audience, to stand or to stroll around while they're listening to music. And those had all been outdoors. But in 1895, the impresario Robert Newman presented the first ever series of indoor promenade concerts at the Albert Hall. And the conductor of that concert, that inaugural promenade concert at the Albert Hall, was Corporal Henry Wood. Oh, no, Sir Henry Wood.
Huh? What do you know about that?
So he'd been knighted, apparently.
Yeah, there you go. All the way from the Crooked Man.
And recovered enough so that he could conduct an orchestra.
Right. Well, no word if he had to be propped up on a stool like James Levine used to Used to do. Well, let us return to this weary workaday world of podcasting right after this quick word from our sponsor.
The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to bakerstreetirregulars.com today.
Okay, and on to our investigation of Carina, who is singing tonight at the Albert Hall, according to Sherlock Holmes in Retired Colorman. Now, this story occurred in 1898, according to chronologists. Couldn't have occurred any earlier than that because of some internal references to 1896 and 97. And in doing so, Holmes kind of gives us a hint as to who Carina might be. And what's interesting here, again, we'll turn to the reference library version of the casebook. Les Klinger identifies three previous papers, at least three previous, maybe four here. Let's see. Guy Warwick and Sherlock Holmes in Music, this is, of course, written in 1947, identifies Carina as Annie Lewis Carey. And Alan Mackler, and we'll get back to Alan in just a moment, in Carina and Identification, selects the Croatian soprano Milka Terina. Donald A. Redman, in A Study in Sources, cites an untitled paper prepared by Patrick Drazen for the Occupants of the Empty House in 1979, which argues the Venezuelan pianist and singer Maria Teresa Carreño, but points out that Carina was the title of a comic opera written by Edward Litt Lehman Blanchard and C. Bridgman, with music by Sophia Julia Wolf. Those are three interesting identifications there, and I think the one we want to spend a little bit of time with was Alan Mackler's. Now, you remember Alan from the Baker Street Irregulars, right, Bernd?
I do remember Alan, yes, absolutely.
Now, to look at Alan is to completely misjudge his skill set and his knowledge. Now, Alan looked like just a regular, well, I don't know what the technical word is, schlub, I guess. He was a pleasant enough guy, but always disheveled. And yet, he was probably the foremost classical music expert, certainly within the Sherlockian universe, but certainly around the country as well. He had a marvelous collection of classical recordings, and his knowledge was really unsurpassed.
Yes, absolutely. And in a paper that was referenced in the note in the Sherlock Holmes Reference Library, actually, for those of you who have your copy handy, it's on page 230 at the bottom of the page, the reference to Alan's paper, he draws on all of his sources, and he says, in fact, I am a musician, I'm a collector of old classical records, and that helped me narrow my research almost at once to a particular singer. But before I could be certain, I had to test my alternative by determining whether or not I could find a singer whose name would be similar to that of Carina, and for which a lack of good penmanship might prove to be a plausible hypothesis.
I love that. When in doubt of a date or a name, always rely on Watson's shoddy penmanship as an excuse.
Yeah, exactly right. And so he went, to his dictionaries and looked at different singers, and he did find a Carina. He found Maria Carina, born in Turin, Italy. Unfortunately, she would have been 4 years old when when this particular concert was being
Maybe
held.
she was a prodigy.
Well, there's no evidence, he says, of her having been a child prodigy. And so that leaves me, he says, with Carina. And then the only other name, he says, I can really find close to that is the famous Croatian soprano Milka Ternina. Ternina, who was born in December of 1863, made her debut in 1882 in Verdi's A Masked Ball. She became a Wagner specialist, and her London debut took place at Covent Garden as Isolde on June 3rd, 1898.
Ha!
The year of the Amberley affair.
How about that? Yeah.
And so he says, since Watson wasn't all that bright about music, it would be rather easy for him to confuse Carina with Ternina, and possibly confuse Albert Hall for Covent Garden. It's amazing how that'll happen. You'll get into a cab in London and say, take me to the Albert Hall, and then the next thing you're at Covent Garden, and you wonder how that happened.
Well, wait a minute. Maybe all that activity in the Blue Carbuncle happened at Albert Hall, not at Covent Garden.
Oh, that's right. Maybe it did. That's a very good point.
Oh, that wasn't in the hall, though, in the concert hall. My mistake.
No. Well, I didn't know that they sold geese in Albert Hall, but it's possible.
Well, it's like buying a turkey leg at Disney World, I think. You see people walking around with the giant turkey legs.
Well, there's no evidence that Watson did that.
Walking around with a goose leg at Albert Hall? Sure.
Disney, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Let's wrap this up here with a lovely little composition that Alan left us with in his identification of Carina. He said, my researches for this brief essay into Sherlockian scholarship led me to the composition of the following salute to musicians in the canon, which I append for the amusement of the musically inclined. There's Norman Neruda of bowing serene, the artiste of Chopinesque fame. And let's not forget about lovely Irene, be Adler or Norton her name. Dereskis are there, brothers Edward and Jean, Wagnerian heroes they be. Carina's there too, though her name is put on. Terina it was, don't you see? And old Sarasate just fiddles along, astonishing all who would hear, by playing a number of self-composed songs, fantasias from G. Meyerbeer. At last comes De Lasso of counterpoint fame, who's written motets in great wealth. And finally that master whose hallowed name's none other than Sherlock himself.
Well, that is lovely, but I am always distressed to find that many Sherlockians who've been down this path have not solved this confusion about Carina successfully, and I don't know why, because it's obvious what the real answer of it is. In fact, Holmes gives us a clue to that when in this particular case, before he mentions Carina, he says he's used the telephone. Well, the telephone is a great clue to the identity of Carina, because the European ocarina dates back to the 19th century, and it was perfected by Giuseppe Donati from Budrio, a town near Bologna, Italy, who transformed the ocarina from a toy which played only a few notes into the first classical ocarina. And he created his classical ocarina based on the principle of a Helmholtz resonator. And as you well know from our previous episodes, Helmholtz was an inspiration to Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone. So there you are. Sherlock Holmes said to Watson, the ocarina sounds sweet tonight at the Albert Hall.
That does ring a bell. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
She had just begun to sing. She has the voice of an angel.